Welcome to the Sales SOS podcast, where we answer your sales distress calls. I'm your host, Liz Hyman, bringing the rescue boat to your sales challenges. In this ever-changing sales environment, it's easy for leaders to feel adrift. We're here to be the beacon guiding you to success. Each episode, I'm joined by top sales experts and practitioners who have navigated this waters and come out victorious. Together, we'll uncover the insights and strategies that will help you hit your sales targets and grow your business. So if you're ready to turn your sales distress into sales success, you're in the right place. Let's dive into today's topic. Welcome to the Sales SOS podcast. I'm Liz Hyman, and we're here to solve your sales problems. Today, we're talking about building your sales organization from the ground up. And we want to talk specifically now about what are the different roles? What do you call them and what do they do? And what I can guarantee is there's going to be a ton of disagreement because these titles and these roles, everybody looks at them differently. So we're going to try to hammer this out together. Let me introduce you to your crew. I want to tell you that Bryn Tillman was with us and she's trying to get back in, so she may jump in with us later. But in addition to Bryn, I have John Way, I have Daryl Prell, I have Mike Simmons, I have Renee Bigelow, Bill Gannon, and Chris Bowen. And if you want to know more about your crew, you can look them up on our website, which is salessospodcast.com. Okay, so guys, let's dive into this. Let's throw out some of these titles and figure out what on earth do they mean, because SDR, BDR, AE, territory manager, customer success, account manager, I don't know, there's got to be a zillion more. Let's start with the one that drives me the most crazy, which is BDR. BDR, as I understand it, stands for business development rep, but I don't know if you guys are seeing the same thing I am. I see this title used across the sales process. So sometimes it's somebody who sits on the phone and either calls back or cold calls. Sometimes I see it used as somebody who's out and about trying to get new leads. Sometimes I see people using it as an alternative to account executive. What are you guys seeing with this term, and how should we be using it? Daryl, if you're listening to us, you can't see that Daryl just put his hand up to his forehead and shook his head, because this is how crazy the naming of these responsibilities are. So help me out, guys, because I'm confused.
I'll go ahead and tee it up first. I'm Bill Gannon, and my career started in Fortune 500 media companies, selling media to sellers, that have brands and want to be in front of eyeballs. Now, this was a classic sales situation. You weren't bringing all kinds of parties together, except for maybe some very extensive packages. But for the most part, you were selling very much of an item. You were selling either an ad in the magazine, an ad on TV. You get the idea. You've heard this. Now, that was very sales oriented. Here's the product. This is who the buyers are. This is what you have to go out and try to close. I think that was a very classic sales executive program. You weren't business developing. You were going out and you were cranking out sales. You'd bring them in, insertion orders. The process was very linear. Several years later, I'm with Qualcomm in San Diego, and we're now trying to cut deals to run applications over a phone, which sounds funny now, like, well, of course, Bill. Well, there was a time that no one did that, I can tell you. And at Qualcomm, you were talking to major carriers like Verizon. You were overseas talking to SDK in Korea. This was absolutely a business development role. There was nothing, you weren't closing anything in a hurry. You were bringing so many parties together and orchestrating so many demos and so many build issues, but you were still supervising and driving the program forward. So to me, when I think of an extensive process with a long sales cycle, I think of that more like a business development person. And when I think of moving an item off the sales conveyor belt and getting the next sale, That's a little bit more transactional and where I kind of put my thinking of sales executive. So if it's transactional, shorter term, I kind of think of sales. When I think of longer term, collaborative, I think of business development. I'm open to disagreement on that.
What do you guys think?
I'll add to that in that the newest piece of the sales evolution tends to be this role in most places. I'm sure there are some other new firms. I mean, maybe ops is newer, but for the most part, this is kind of a new addition to the sales machine. And it is the place that I find is the most frontier-like and Wild West. To your metaphor, Liz, there's a lot of cowboy in this role because when there are new things, people can make their name, people can develop real estate and claim it as their own, right? And it's not clearly defined as an industry standard. So to add to the confusion around this role, Daryl's already pointed out, is it SDR, BDR? Bill's pointed out, is it for long-term relationships? You've pointed out, is it for prospecting or just appointment setting? To add to this, in some companies, a BDR or SDR would report to marketing because it's part of lead generation or a demand generation team, right? And not in the traditional sales leadership, right? Not under sales management. So it really is a Wild West scenario. But in most instances, I would say it's about getting everybody to a conversation that you can then start to sell and close. I would say that's probably the most universal that I have seen out in all of these different scenarios. And I say that saying, as head of marketing, I've had BDRs report to me too. So it really is crazy out in the wild.
All right. Everything you just heard, not at all what I've seen. All right. So, because, hey, let's have some fun. All right. So here's what I've seen. I've seen where it's big business. You're selling 7-figure deals. What Bill just described, 1,000%. If you're selling SaaS, nothing to do with what he just said. If you're selling SaaS, it's an AE, what he might call transactional. But if the AE wants to hold, and they want to be the one to have the selling strategy, they want to be the one who develops the buying committee. The SDR, to Renee's point, often resides in marketing, probably 40 to 50% of the time these days. It resides in marketing because it's just the next step in qualification. If I have an inbound lead because they attended a webinar, they did do a trade show, they downloaded an ebook or a white paper, then you want to do a further qualification above and beyond what was available on the form. And if they pass that litmus test, then you pass it off to the AE to pursue. The BDR is in sales and is often looking for leads above and beyond what marketing's done and what the AE's done. Remember, the AE's working the active deals that the SDRs have screened for them, all right? Whereas the BDRs out there actually picking up the phone, dialing for dollars, doing those, 7 touches in 7 days, whatever you want to call them, trying to develop new business, not content like marketing is doing, the SDR is qualifying on. So there you go. Just to show you, it all depends on who you ask and why this is so bloody confusing.
So nobody's mentioned the MDR.
Oh, geez.
Just thought I'd throw it in there.
Why don't you like us,
development
Liz?
Rep, right? Is that right?
Say that again, Liz.
An MDR, is that marketing development rep?
That one's new to me.
It's still pretty nascent, but yes.
Okay. So, Chris, what do you got for us on this?
I think that I've seen BDR, SDR work relatively interchangeable at companies. Like you can't really tell from one organization to the next whether that's going to be the exact same type of role. And the same thing maybe for AEs, because you'll see some places where they go more full cycle instead of segmenting their sales process. I know we already had that discussion, but I think that's a portion of the real challenge is how have you designed your process? How do you expect it to work? How does that serve the organization or your customers, or both ideally? as far as how you're getting it through, and why is it that you need those roles? Are you just trying to piggyback on what somebody else has done that's been successful? So if you say, oh, what I really want to do is this worked really well at Salesforce. Okay, yeah, but you're a $10 million company, right? Like maybe that should be your aspirational goal, but maybe that's not where you want to start, right? Figure out what your process really should be, understand that, then understand whether there's parts of that need to be segmented off, because of we have too much volume relative on the front end of our pipeline, but the number of things that actually fall through that really need that extra attention, professionalism, what have you, is limited. So maybe there you're segmenting because you need to control the top of the funnel, right? But I think you have to figure out what your process is. At least that's how I tend to look at it.
Chris, can I piggyback on that and just say, here's why I've seen it so Wild West, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's Wild West because it's new, right? And it's to be defined. But the reason that I've seen it be so different is because traditionally that role is brought in once you get a bottleneck, right? Or you have a conversion problem. And then you start looking at your process and you figure out where your problem is. I've been in some companies where the problem is your sellers having time to prospect, right? And that's when you bring in somebody that uses a BDR to go out and do prospecting calls. I've been in other places where you have more leads coming in than your small sales team can manage. And therefore you have to make sure that you're not just qualifying them. It's also sometimes getting them to show up. So if you have a very small sales team and they're scheduling, say in SaaS, like demos, your show up rate can matter greatly, right? Because your AE can only book if that's an hour booked, then they can't be in there. So having the BDR just be the appointment setter often works really well because that's the problem that you're trying to solve. And then you have other ones where you need to get the full buying committee together and bring people aboard for more like account-based management sort of things. So it really kind of has become the Wild West because everybody's using this as the new lever to block bottlenecks. I mean, to open up bottlenecks or to figure out conversion problems.
Yeah, I think if you're dealing with it from an intentionality perspective, that I get, right? Because we've identified a problem. Here's how we're going to attack that problem. What I've seen, not necessarily executed successfully, is when they're just trying to look at what somebody else is doing and saying, "Oh, we're going to do that," and not really understand the process or really the problem that was set up to solve. It's like the worst kind of mimicry.
John, what have you got? What are your thoughts in this?
Well, I think I would definitely double down on the evolving organization and the evolving titles, because that's usually what happens. And I think from what I've seen, the bottleneck, to really double click on what Renee said, the bottleneck tends to be talent and what they're capable of. It's not usually systems or anything like that. It's can you find enough full cycle? Usually not. Those tend to be unicorns. And so now you're like, okay, I found a whole bunch of people that's really, really good at closing, but not really good at prospecting. So then you kind of, that's usually how it starts, is that you end up having a bottleneck in terms of staffing.
Well,
and then that's when you start specializing.
Because we're going to talk about that in a minute when we go into talking about hiring the right people. But this myth that a salesperson is a salesperson and you hire a salesperson and they can fit into any job, that is completely mythical. Unicorns are mythical. I will say there are cowboys, but I still don't believe in unicorns, at least not from sales perspective. Mike, I see you ready to tell us something here.
I think we're not talking about like the he who shall not be named, which is the leadership component in here, and how we continue to screw this stuff up. Because we go in and like we talk about this being new in the Wild Wild West. Ross's book came out in 2011 and it created havoc inside organization when executives read the book and then said, we needed to have this level of specialization. It worked for that group. We need to do it. You have some people, leaders, who are out there reading books and then playing sales leaders. And I'm tired of it. So like that's the extent of what I have to share in this part of the conversation, because it just is, it's frustrating to me, because what we forget is we're dealing with people's lives. We're dealing with families. We're dealing with customers. We're dealing with experience. We're dealing with revenue. We're dealing with the lifeblood of organizations. And we're out there playing as leaders because we read something in a book and we think, hey, this is a pretty cool title to solve for a lack of leadership inside our organization.
Well, I think there's also another really important part of this, Mike, because I think you hit that right, that nail right on the head. But every organization has to look at who they're selling to and how they're selling. One of the things that I get really frustrated with SaaS companies, software as a service, is that they are of the belief that if it was done that way by Salesforce, everybody should do it that way. So this is the SaaS model. We all need to use the SaaS model, but we are selling a different kind of product. Some SaaS products are very expensive and they require complete changes in the organization. Some SaaS products go into the organization really easily, one by one, a little bit at a time. It doesn't really matter. So if we're in manufacturing, we may be selling into a completely different environment. And Mike just texted me, and I'm going to say this out loud. The investors are probably the worst part of this scenario because they did it this way at their last business. And Daryl's doing it again. If you're listening, you can't see Daryl putting his hand to his forehead and shaking his head like this. We as consultants who are out in the world trying to help these companies who have investors who, like, I did it this way last time, it worked, we're going to do it this way again. It doesn't always work depending upon who you're selling to, how expensive your product is, how it changes the sales environment. There's a simple sale and there's a complex sale, and those two things need to be treated really differently. What do you got to say about that, folks?
I just want to reiterate the investors thing. Oh man, you hit Mike's sitting there laughing. Here's what you need to know, folks. When you're putting a sales org together, you will have investors, especially if it's a PE company, pushing you hard to do a certain structure, because that's what they've done at all their other companies, regardless if they sell the same thing to the same customer at the same selling point. And they will say it with conviction and they will intimidate you. 9 times out of 10, they do not know what they're talking about. They've never run a company. They've never built a sales team themselves. They've never actually been in the trenches. So take it as an input, but consult with your peers in the industry who sell like services at like price points to like buyers, and learn from them first and foremost.
And if you're an investor and you'd like to sponsor our program, I'm just kidding. What else? What are the final thoughts about building this sales organization? Do what works for you and your customer. Understand your customer's customer journey. Understand the complexity of what you're selling. Think about all these pieces before you decide what you're doing. Think about the skills of the people that you have, or hire the right people with the right set of skills. John, what are you thinking?
Well, I was actually going to say, especially taking into account the customer journey and what we talked about in the last episode, which is if you have a sales organization where you're going through a ton of handoffs, most people don't like to go through a ton of handoffs. Mm-hmm. They don't want to talk to 5 different people before they, get to a decision. So especially at the beginning, if you can get away with it, just have them talk to one person. If that works, try to ride that out as much as you can.
The one thing I'll say is you're going to have a lot of opinions, hence why it's so critical to communicate with all the key stakeholders in the leadership and in the investors to seek their input and let them feel heard. They will often see something you hadn't thought about, so you can refine your approach to building your team. But with that said, there's a couple of things you need to do to protect yourself and to ensure long-term success. One is you need to have systems in place to measure the progress, whether it's an AE, an SDR, a BDR, a full cycle rep. If you don't have the systems in place to measure them so you know how profitable you are or how expensive that cost of sale is, you got a real problem. And that also going to use that exact same data to actually upgrade or replace people if necessary because they don't have the skills that they presented themselves as having in the interview process. So that's the first part. Second part is be prepared to shift gears quickly. If you thought a full cycle model was the way to go and after 3 months it's not working, you should seriously be giving thoughts to saying, okay, do I need to shift into maybe an AE SDR model or some version thereof, whatever it might be based on what you're selling. The point is you need to be flexible and don't lock in. So if you communicate often, you measure often, you share that data with everybody else, including your own employees who are in the revenue side, and then you partner with finance and with ops to make sure the systems are in place to make sure the team is successful, then you will be successful yourself. But you're likely not going to get the right structure on the first go round. The last thing I'll say is you have to partner big time with marketing and ops so that you each know where you are in that customer journey, because the customer journey doesn't start with sales. The customer journey starts with marketing. And that includes the forms that they're filling out and the qualifying data. All right. So, and because that data is going to be passed on to sales to help them further qualify and do due diligence and build the buying committee and whatever you want to do. So you've got to have a tight partnership. So your sales structure is not an island. It's not isolated. That's the biggest thing I can say, the biggest mistake I see made all the time.
So I also want to just point out really quickly that if you do not have the bandwidth or the means to hire that SDR, VDR, or that qualifying team or that outbound team, the other option is you can outsource it as you're starting. So thinking about, maybe you can't hire the level of staff you need for marketing. You think about outsourcing that. And at what point do you bring it into the organization? And this, Daryl, I love the part about measuring the return on investment. So, this, and we're going to have this conversation more about how you set up your CRM to do some of these things. But if you're not measuring where that lead came from all the way through to the first close, and if you sell something else to them and sell something else to them, you will never know what your return on investment really was. And most of the time, once it converts into an opportunity, we lose the lead source, and we certainly lose it after the second one. So how are you measuring what it takes to achieve the goals and what your costs really are? If you're interested, you can send me a note on LinkedIn. This is Liz Hyman, and I will send you my tool for measuring your return on investment. It's really simple to use. Anything else we want to wrap up on this topic of what are the different roles?
Liz, I have one to just kind of add as sort of an overview and a universal thought. The thing that I would say when you're trying to figure out which roles and which model to use, the North Star is to think about the experience with your brand. This is not a place where I think a lot of people automatically think brand, but the experience with your brand is what's going to establish trust and build your reputation. And a brand is nothing but a container for trust, right? So inside of that, the number one way that someone's going to have an experience with your brand is what happens through this process, through this customer journey, right? And marketing and sales, customer success, they're all going to touch that. So if you use that as your North Star, and the other thing to remember is there's a mirror side of that, which is the employee experience, right? Because if you have unhappy salespeople, guess what? You ain't making money, right? Like you might for a short term, right? But so it has to match most. So whatever you're building out, if you think about what kind of experience is this creating that will impact my brand, because the experience that people have with your company and with your brand is how they will form their opinions and reputation. So what is the experience I'm creating as they move through this customer journey? And what is the experience that my employees are having trying to help them move through? That is a really good North Star for trying to figure out this complicated process.
Okay. Can we wrap this up on that note?
One more thing,
Sure.
just super quickly. You can outsource all of this. Like you have experts that are on this call who take on specific components of everything that we're talking about here and are really, really good at what they do. And it's really hard to do this inside your organization because you have other work that you've got to get done. You've got other biases that you have. You've got other things that will get in the way. And So don't fail alone at this. And to build on Daryl's point around communication, remember one of the biggest challenges with communication or biggest mistakes is believing that it happened. Validate understanding on the other side that we've actually agreed to this thing. Document, validate, confirm, share. And then when people challenge, you can point them back to what we all agreed on and then ask this simple question: what changed?
And that's a wrap of this episode of the Sales SOS podcast. A huge thank you to our experts for throwing us a lifeline with their insights. We hope today's episode has equipped you to navigate the sales seas with confidence. Never miss an episode. Subscribe to the Sales SOS podcast on your favorite platform. If you have questions, comments, or topics you'd like us to explore, join us live on LinkedIn every second Friday, or share your questions on YouTube or LinkedIn. Until next time, keep sailing towards those sales goals. I'm Liz Hyman, your captain here at the Sales SOS podcast, saying smooth sailing and successful selling.